Some people wait for days. Some wait for years. I waited for a letter that never came. Not because I was foolish. Not because I didn't have choices. But because once, a long time ago, someone looked at me and said, "I'll write." And I believed him. This is not a story about what I lost. It's about what waiting gave me. That afternoon is still clear in my mind. Not sharp. Not loud. Just clear. The kind of clear that comes from remembering something gentle. Something that didn't hurt yet. It was early fall. I remember because the air had that smell. Dry leaves, warm dust, and a little bit of something sweet drifting from somewhere down the street. I was standing by the front window. The old one with the loose latch that rattled when trucks went by. I hadn't fixed it yet back then. Didn't see the need. I wasn't waiting for anything special that day. At least, I didn't think I was. He had been there earlier. Just for a little while. Long enough to sit at the kitchen table and drink half a cup of coffee. Long enough to tell me he had to go. He always said things softly. Like he didn't want to leave fingerprints on the air. I remember the way his hands looked wrapped around that chipped mug. The blue one with the thin crack down the side. I'd offered him a different cup, but he shook his head. "This one's fine," he said. Everything was always fine back then. When he stood up to leave, he hesitated by the door. Not in a dramatic way. Just enough for me to notice. He turned and looked at me like he was memorizing something. My face, maybe. Or the room. Or the way the afternoon light landed on the floor between us. "I'll write," he said. Not "I might." Not "I'll try." "I'll write." I didn't ask when. Didn't ask how long. Didn't ask what he would say. I just nodded. I trusted words more in those days. He touched the doorframe on his way out. Ran his fingers along it like he always did. A habit, I think. Something to do with leaving. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Not a slam. Not a goodbye that demanded attention. Just a quiet ending to an ordinary visit. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Listening. I could hear his footsteps for a few seconds. Then nothing. That was when the waiting started. Not loudly. Not all at once. It slipped in so gently I didn't even notice. I went back to the kitchen. Rinsed his mug. Set it upside down in the drying rack. I remember thinking, I'll wash it properly later. Like he might be back for it. The rest of the day moved along like it always did. I swept the floor. Folded laundry. Sat on the porch for a while when the sun dipped low. Every now and then, my mind wandered back to his voice. "I'll write." It sounded solid. Reliable. Like a fence post driven deep into the ground. That night before bed, I checked the mailbox. Not because I expected anything. Just because it was there. It was empty, of course. I smiled at myself. Felt a little foolish. Went inside. The first few days passed easily. I didn't count them yet. I'd hear a car slow down outside and feel a small lift in my chest. Not excitement. Just recognition. I told myself letters took time. That people had lives. That promises didn't need rushing. I believed all of that. The mailbox became part of my morning. Coffee on the stove. Slippers on my feet. A slow walk down the short path. Empty. Every time. But empty didn't mean disappointing yet. Empty just meant not today. I remember the exact morning it changed. It was maybe a week later. The sun hadn't fully come up. The sky was pale and unsure. I opened the mailbox and felt something unfamiliar. Expectation. Not hope. Expectation. That's a heavier thing. When there was nothing inside, I stood there longer than usual. Rested my hand on the metal edge. Felt how cold it was. That was the first time waiting made a sound in my chest. A soft, hollow echo. Still, I told myself the same things. Good things. Reasonable things. He said he'd write. And I believed him. I went back inside and closed the door carefully. Like I didn't want to disturb the promise hanging in the air. That night, lying in bed, I thought about what his letter might look like. His handwriting. The way he crossed his T's too hard. The way his sentences always ran long. I imagined opening it slowly. Sitting at the table. Reading it twice. I fell asleep holding that thought. I didn't know then that this was the easy part. The gentle beginning. Back when waiting still felt like love. Waiting doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask permission. It settles in the way dust does. So slow you don't notice until it's everywhere. At first, I told myself I wasn't waiting. I was just living. I still woke up early. Still made my bed the same way, corners tucked tight, quilt smoothed flat. Still ate my breakfast at the small table by the window. But every morning ended the same. With the mailbox. I didn't rush to it. I never did. That felt desperate. I walked at a steady pace. Slippers scuffing the ground. Robins hopping away as I came near. Most mornings, I already knew what I'd find. Nothing. But knowing and accepting are two different things. I started to notice patterns. The mailman came later on Tuesdays. On Thursdays, he whistled sometimes. On rainy days, the envelopes curled at the corners. I learned these things without meaning to. Because waiting teaches you to watch. I told myself his letter would come when it was ready. That words needed time to find their way. So I gave them space. Weeks passed. Then more weeks. The calendar on the wall changed months. I crossed off days without thinking much about it. I still believed. Belief was easy when nothing else had challenged it yet. Waiting began to shape my days. I planned errands around mail time. Chose seats where I could see the road. Paused conversations when I heard footsteps outside. These weren't sacrifices. They felt natural. Like making room for someone who wasn't there yet. At night, I lined up possibilities in my mind. Maybe he'd lost my address. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he wanted to write something worth keeping. I liked that last one best. It made the waiting feel purposeful. The mailbox became more than a box. It was a promise holder. A small metal chest where hope rested each day. I cleaned it once. Polished the latch. Oiled the hinge so it wouldn't squeak. I told myself it was just maintenance. But really, I wanted his letter to arrive somewhere cared for. There were moments when I forgot to check. A few rare mornings when I'd sit down with my coffee and realize the mail had already come and gone. Those moments startled me. Not because I'd missed the letter, but because I'd almost forgotten to wait. I'd put my cup down slowly. Walk to the door. Open the box. Empty. Relief followed disappointment in quick succession. Relief meant I hadn't failed at waiting yet. People asked about him sometimes. Not often. Just enough. Have you heard from him? I smiled when I answered. Said, not yet. That word, yet, did a lot of work back then. Waiting gave me something steady. Something to hold onto when days felt too quiet. I wasn't lonely. Not really. I had the future. Or at least the idea of it. I began writing letters in my head. Answers to words I hadn't read yet. I practiced my reactions. Where I'd sit. What I'd feel first. Joy? Relief? Maybe tears. Waiting let me rehearse happiness. It filled the space where uncertainty might have lived. But slowly, almost kindly, waiting began to press back. I noticed how the sound of the mailbox closing felt heavier than it used to. How I stood a little longer afterward. How my breath paused before I turned away. Waiting had a weight now. Still manageable. Still familiar. I adjusted. That's what people do. We shape ourselves around absence the way water shapes stone. Quietly. Over time. By then, I no longer asked when the letter would come. That question had worn itself out. Instead, I asked how long I could keep believing without changing. I didn't know the answer. So I kept waiting. And waiting, by then, had learned the shape of me too. It wasn't the silence that hurt at first. It was the noise around it. The world kept talking, kept writing, kept arriving. The mailbox began to fill with other people's lives. Bills, advertisements, birthday cards for neighbors tucked into the wrong slot and handed back politely. I held those envelopes every day, felt their weight, the proof that paper could travel, that words could find their way from one place to another, just not his. I watched others open letters with casual hands. At the post office, on front porches, at kitchen tables where voices rose and fell with news. They tore envelopes without thinking, folded papers once, twice, sometimes not at all. I wondered what that felt like. To expect words and receive them. Friends spoke about letters they'd gotten. From sons. From sisters. From people who remembered. I nodded. Smiled. Asked the right questions. All the while, my hands stayed empty. I told myself not to compare. That silence was its own kind of message. But silence doesn't explain itself. It just sits there. The first time I felt embarrassed was unexpected. A neighbor, Mrs. Collins, waved a letter at me one morning. Her face bright with news. From my nephew, she said, asking me to come visit. She waited for my response. For something similar. I congratulated her. Meant it. Then I went inside and closed the door softly. I stood by the mail slot for a long moment after that, listening to nothing. Other people's joy began to feel like a mirror, showing me what I didn't have. Not in a jealous way. In a quiet, aching way. The kind you don't talk about. The mailman learned my face. Nodded when he handed me envelopes. Some days he said, "That's it for today." Like he was apologizing. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault. That he was doing his job just fine. But I didn't. Because part of me still believed tomorrow would be different. I began to recognize his handwriting on envelopes addressed to neighbors. The loops. The slant. I imagined recognizing his handwriting the same way. Instantly. Without doubt. I'd wake in the morning and tell myself not to expect anything. And then feel disappointed anyway. That contradiction wore on me. I tried staying inside when the mail came. Pretended I didn't care. But the sound of the slot opening pulled at me like a string. Silence followed. Again. I remember one afternoon in particular. I was sitting at the table, sorting through mail that wasn't meant for me. Junk. Notices. Things that needed throwing away. I held an envelope longer than necessary. It wasn't his. I knew that. But I wanted to feel what it was like to open something addressed with intention. I set it down unopened. Like it might be contagious. I didn't want to pretend. Silence has a way of making you question your own memory. Your own importance. I replayed his words again and again. I'll write. I tested them. Turned them over. They hadn't changed. But the space around them had. Sometimes I wondered if the letter had come and gone without me. If I'd missed it somehow. That thought scared me more than the idea of it never coming at all. Because missing it would mean I failed at the only thing I was still doing. Waiting. I asked fewer questions out loud. Kept more answers to myself. Other people's letters kept arriving. Proof of connection. Of effort. Mine stayed invisible. And slowly, without anyone saying it, the silence stopped feeling neutral. It began to feel chosen. That was when waiting first felt lonely. Not because I was alone. But because I was the only one listening. Time didn't rush past me. It walked. Slow enough for me to see it coming. Steady enough that I couldn't stop it. The first winter arrived without announcement. Just colder mornings. Stiffer fingers. A heavier coat hanging by the door. I still checked the mailbox. Snow gathered on top of it sometimes. I brushed it off with my glove. Like clearing a path. The mail felt thinner in winter. Paper more fragile. Footsteps quieter. No letter. Spring came next. Soft and apologetic. As if it knew it was late. The trees budded. Neighbors planted flowers. Someone down the street painted their porch a bright yellow. I noticed these things. Because waiting teaches you to look. Every season brought new reasons to believe. New excuses. Summer meant travel. Fall meant change. I let each one explain his silence for him. Holidays passed like markers on a road I wasn't sure I was still on. Thanksgiving. Christmas. Birthdays I celebrated alone but not unhappily. I told myself he might write during a holiday. People do sentimental things then. They think of the past. I straightened the house before Christmas one year. Not because anyone was coming. Just in case. The calendar pages turned without ceremony. 1 year. Then another. At some point, I stopped keeping track. Waiting stretched time instead of filling it. I aged quietly. Not in a dramatic way. Just small changes. A new line by my eyes. A slower walk to the mailbox. The mailbox stayed the same. Paint chipped. Hinge squeaked again. I didn't fix it right away. I didn't want it to look too different from the day he promised to write. People moved away. New families moved in. Children grew tall. Old friends passed on. Life kept rearranging itself around me. I stayed put. Seasons became less about weather and more about memory. Fall reminded me of the day he left. Winter of the first year I waited through snow. Spring of the time I almost stopped checking. Almost. Summer evenings stretched long. I sat on the porch and listened to distant laughter. Thought about how time sounds when you're not part of it. I didn't mark anniversaries of his leaving. I didn't want to give that moment power. But my body remembered anyway. Some days, waiting felt lighter. Like a habit you forget you have. Other days, it pressed hard. Reminded me that time was moving without permission. Still, no answers came. No explanation. No apology. No ending. Just seasons stacking on top of each other like folded blankets. I folded myself into them. At some point, I realized I was no longer waiting for a letter. I was waiting for proof that waiting had meant something. That all these seasons weren't wasted. That love didn't vanish just because it wasn't written down. I watched leaves fall one year and thought, everything lets go eventually. I didn't. Winter came again. And then spring. And then more years than I care to count. Still no letter. Still waiting. By then, waiting wasn't something I did. It was something I lived inside. Doubt doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice or knock things over. It sits down quietly. Like it belongs there. I can't tell you exactly when it arrived. Only that one day, it was already in the room with me. At first, it asked small questions. Polite ones. Did he mean what he said? Did I hear him correctly? I brushed those questions aside. I'd learned how to do that. But doubt is patient. It waits longer than hope does. Soon, the questions changed shape. Did I misunderstand him? Did he promise to write, or did I want him to? That one stayed with me. Memory is a fragile thing when it's held alone. I replayed that afternoon over and over. The kitchen. The mug. The doorframe. I tried to see it from the outside. Tried to watch myself standing there. Did he hesitate? Or did I imagine that too? Doubt didn't accuse him at first. It came for me instead. It asked why I believed so easily. Why I never asked for more. It suggested that maybe I wasn't memorable enough to be written to. That thought hurt more than silence ever had. I found myself explaining things to no one. He's busy. He had good intentions. Life happens. I said these things out loud sometimes, just to hear them sound reasonable. The house grew quieter as doubt grew louder. Rooms felt bigger. Evenings longer. I noticed my reflection more. In windows. In mirrors. I saw the years in my face. And wondered when they started to show. I wondered if he'd recognize me now. I wondered if he'd still write if he saw who I'd become. That question lingered. Doubt changed the way I waited. I checked the mailbox with less ceremony. Less care. Some days, I let mail sit unopened on the table. As if ignoring it might protect me. I caught myself rehearsing disappointment instead of joy. That was new. I began to imagine explanations that didn't end kindly. Maybe he met someone else. Maybe he forgot. Maybe I mattered less than I thought. Each possibility settled like dust. I tried to clean it away. But it always came back. The hardest part wasn't believing he wouldn't write. It was believing he never intended to. That thought rewrote everything. It turned a promise into a misunderstanding. Turned devotion into foolishness. I felt small under it. I stopped talking about him altogether. Not because I was ashamed. Because I didn't know how to explain someone who existed mostly in my past. Waiting had once felt noble. Faithful. Now it felt exposed. I questioned my own strength. Was I strong for waiting? Or weak for not letting go? Doubt made me suspicious of my own heart. Some nights, I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. The settling walls. The ticking clock. I asked myself if I was still waiting for him. Or if I was waiting to forgive myself for believing. That question didn't have an answer. Morning still came. The mailbox still stood. But doubt walked with me now. It stood beside me as I opened the lid. As I saw nothing inside. It whispered, "Of course there's nothing." I hated that voice. But I didn't know how to make it leave. Still, even with doubt in the room, I didn't stop waiting. Because doubt hadn't replaced love. It had just complicated it. And love, even wounded, still held the door open. People think staying is easier than leaving. It isn't. Leaving has movement. Staying has weight. By the time the word move on reached my ears, I already knew what it meant. I just didn't like how lightly people said it. As if love were a coat you could shrug off. As if waiting were a mistake instead of a decision. Opportunities came. Not loudly. Not dramatically. They arrived as invitations. Conversations that lingered a little too long. Looks that asked questions without words. I noticed them. I wasn't blind. I just didn't reach for them. Each time, I felt the same quiet pause inside myself. A moment where I could step forward. And didn't. People assumed fear kept me where I was. That I was afraid to be hurt again. That wasn't it. I was afraid of undoing what I'd already given. Waiting had cost me years. But it had also given me shape. It taught me patience. It taught me how to sit with silence without breaking it. Moving on felt like erasing something sacred. I told myself I was being loyal. Not to him exactly. To the promise. There's a difference. I didn't imagine futures with other people. Didn't allow myself that softness. It felt like cheating on something unfinished. Some nights, I wondered what my life might have looked like if I'd chosen differently. If I'd said yes once. Just once. That thought passed like a cloud. I didn't chase it. Staying wasn't about hope anymore. It was about meaning. I needed waiting to mean something. Otherwise, it was just time lost. I learned to live gently within that choice. I filled my days with small certainties. Routine. Familiar rooms. The same chair by the window. I made peace with being alone without calling it loneliness. Because loneliness implies lack. I didn't feel lacking. I felt committed. There were moments of temptation. Of course there were. Times when the house felt too quiet. When a second cup on the table felt unnecessary. I acknowledged those moments. Then let them go. Waiting had become my way of honoring what was. Not what might come. People stopped asking after a while. They sensed my answer before I gave it. I didn't explain myself anymore. Choice doesn't need defending when you've made it enough times. I stayed. Not because I was stuck. Because I decided to. And every day I stayed, the waiting changed shape again. It became quieter. Less sharp. Like grief that has settled into memory. I wasn't waiting for him to return. I was waiting because leaving felt like forgetting. And forgetting was the one thing I wasn't ready to do. The world learned new ways to talk to itself. Phones got smaller. Voices traveled faster. People stopped writing letters the way they used to. Ink gave way to screens. Envelopes became rare. I noticed. Waiting makes you notice what disappears. The mailbox stayed where it had always been. A little faded. A little crooked. It outlived most of the habits around it. Neighbors stopped checking theirs every day. Mail piled up. Some boxes stayed shut for weeks. Mine opened daily. It didn't matter what time it was anymore. Morning or afternoon. I still checked. The mailman changed faces over the years. Different walks. Different greetings. None of them knew my story. To them, I was just a woman who still believed in paper. I watched the street change. Houses repainted. Driveways widened. Children who once rode bicycles grew into parents. I stayed the same size in their memories. If I existed there at all. The mailbox remembered me. Technology crept into the house slowly. A radio first. Then a television. Later, things I didn't fully trust. Machines that spoke back. Messages without handwriting. I never expected a letter through any of those. Waiting is particular. It wants things done a certain way. The mailbox rusted slightly at the edges. I sanded it down once. Painted it carefully. Not to make it new. To keep it alive. Sometimes I imagined the letter arriving late. Decades late. I wondered if paper aged like people. If ink faded or stayed sharp. I wondered if I'd still be able to read his handwriting. The world didn't wait with me. It moved on, whether I wanted it to or not. Stores closed. New ones opened. Old roads were renamed. But the path to the mailbox stayed the same. Worn into the ground by my steps. People asked why I still bothered. I didn't answer. Because explaining waiting to someone who has never done it feels impossible. Waiting became a ritual. Not hopeful. Not desperate. Just faithful. The mailbox didn't judge. It didn't ask questions. It held space. Some days, I rested my hand on it longer than necessary. Felt the cool metal. It grounded me. The world sped up. I slowed down. We stopped trying to keep pace with each other. And somehow, in that quiet standoff, I felt steady. Still waiting. There comes a time when questions grow tired. Not answered. Just tired. They stop pushing. Stop demanding space in your mind. They sit quietly, like old furniture you no longer trip over. I don't remember deciding to make peace with not knowing. It happened the way most real changes do. Gradually. Without ceremony. One morning, I opened the mailbox and felt something different. Not disappointment. Not hope. Nothing rose up to meet the emptiness. And that surprised me. I stood there longer than usual. Waiting for the feeling to catch up. It didn't. That was when I understood something had shifted. Not in the world. In me. I stopped asking why. Why he never wrote. Why promises sometimes dissolve without explanation. Those questions had shaped my days for years. Letting them go felt strange. Like setting down something I'd been carrying for so long I forgot it was heavy. Not knowing became acceptable. Not comfortable, but manageable. I didn't need a reason anymore. I realized answers wouldn't change what had already been lived. They wouldn't give the years back. They wouldn't soften the waiting. So I stopped chasing them. I began to notice what was still mine. My mornings. My memories. The quiet rhythm of a life lived carefully. Not knowing didn't erase love. It simply removed the sharp edges. I could think of him without wondering. Without rewriting the past in search of clarity. I remembered him as he was. Not as a question. Some days, I still felt the absence. Of course I did. Acceptance doesn't mean forgetting. It means allowing space without filling it with pain. I found myself speaking less to the silence. I didn't argue with it anymore. Silence stopped feeling like an opponent. It became a companion. I learned that not every story offers an ending you can hold. Some end by dissolving. Others end by becoming part of you. Waiting had taught me patience. Not knowing taught me peace. They're not the same. Peace doesn't erase longing. It just quiets it. I didn't forgive him. There was nothing to forgive. I forgave myself. For believing. For waiting. For staying. That forgiveness felt like air returning to a closed room. I could breathe again. The mailbox stayed. So did the ritual. But the wait changed. I no longer needed the letter to arrive. I just needed to know that waiting had not broken me. And it hadn't. Not knowing stopped being a wound. It became a place I could rest. For a long time, I believed the letter was the point. That everything I'd done, every morning walk, every quiet hope, every year of waiting, was aimed at a single envelope finding its way to me. I imagined it as something solid. Proof. But as the years settled into me, that idea softened. The letter stopped being something that might arrive. It became something that already had. Not in my hands. In my life. I began to understand that what I was waiting for wasn't information. It was affirmation. I wanted to know I had mattered. That the moment we shared hadn't been one-sided. That the promise wasn't just something I carried alone. Waiting wasn't about paper. It was about believing my memory was real. The letter represented intention. Care. The idea that someone would pause their life long enough to reach back. When it didn't come, I thought that intention had vanished. But intention doesn't always travel forward. Sometimes it stays where it was born. I realized the letter had already done its work. It gave me permission to love without rushing the end. It allowed me to build a life that honored patience. Waiting taught me who I was when no one was watching. The letter wasn't missing. It had been unfolding all along. In the way I stayed. In the way I chose loyalty over ease. In the way I learned to sit with silence and not turn bitter. The letter shaped me more than any words ever could. I didn't need to read it to understand it. Its message was written in years. In the mornings I showed up anyway. In the evenings I closed the door gently. I stopped seeing the mailbox as empty. It was full of proof. Proof that love doesn't always arrive on time. But it leaves marks. I wasn't waiting for an apology. Or an explanation. I was waiting to understand what the waiting meant. And now I did. The letter was never meant to arrive. It was meant to change me. I still check the mailbox. Not because I expect anything. Not because I need proof. I do it the way some people say a prayer they no longer ask answers from. Out of habit. Out of respect. The walk is slower now. My steps careful. The ground familiar beneath my feet. The mailbox looks older too. Or maybe I do. I open it the same way every time. Gently. There is nothing inside. And that's all right. Waiting doesn't feel sharp anymore. It doesn't pull at me. It rests. Like a memory you've told often enough that it no longer surprises you. I don't imagine the letter now. Don't wonder what it would say. There's no need. Everything it might have meant has already been lived. I sit by the window more these days. Watch light move across the floor. I think about the girl I was when waiting began. How certain she was. How open. I don't feel sorry for her. She loved fully. That matters. Some stories don't arrive with endings. They stay open. They breathe. Waiting became part of me. Not as loss. As texture. It taught me how to hold space without filling it. How to love without demanding return. People sometimes ask if I regret it. I don't. Regret looks backward. Waiting taught me how to stay present. I don't wait with longing anymore. I wait with memory. With gratitude. With a soft understanding that love doesn't always need completion to be real. The mailbox closes. The day continues. And I am at peace. If it reminded you of someone you once waited for, you're not alone. Many of us carry love that never got an ending. And that doesn't make it small. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories told slowly, stories about love, memory, and the things we hold on to, please subscribe to American Granny Stories. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment below and tell me, what did you wait for? I'll be here, waiting with you.